Hello and welcome to episode number 2 of my One Tracking Plan a Day series, which is season 1. As you can see, I'm quite optimistic that I will do this again. But let's see. Again, we have episode 2 out of 20. Today we're talking about Slack. So this season focuses on tools that startup will use, and I most likely will say that Slack is the most used tools in startups. I personally use it myself as well, and so at least I have a little bit of an idea what we will talking about today. The major focus of the whole series is we will create a tracking plan. I want to show you how I make decisions when I make a tracking plan. Obviously, at the end you will see a tracking plan. At the end you will see how we create the tracking plan. But for me, the most important major takeaway that you should hopefully have is that you understand in which parts I make specific decisions. Because in the end, we're talking here about design process. So there's no right and wrong. So you can approach tracking plans in totally different kind of ways. I have a very specific way. With every setup that I do a first version, and then I have a time where I tinker about specific kind of decisions. It's also the reason why I create the initial tracking plan with the help of AI, because it speeds up the initial draft period, which usually would take 2 or 3 hours and which would be okay on video, but I think after the first time pretty boring. I really want to focus in this video series on the parts where I have to make decisions about, okay, does this actually make sense? Should we maybe design it a little bit differently? What is the pro and the cons? Because in the end, all the different solutions that we will discuss will work, but in the end, you have to pick one. And so I just want to give you a good idea why I pick a specific one and maybe against something else. Okay, so with that said, we will talk about Slack today. And we do the same thing like we did in the first video. If you haven't watched the first video was with Notion. So you can check it out. You will find it on YouTube as well. You can check it out. You can watch it and also make sure to subscribe and potentially like the video if you like it, so that you can see all the next episodes that are coming up, because there's still 18 to go. But okay, how do we do this? First of all, we will use my book, which is the Analytics Implementation Workbook, as context for Claude to create the tracking plan. Here's the book. Here you can check it out. I won't go super deep into this. In the end, it describes a lot how you design tracking plans, but it also goes beyond that, looking into how to implement analytics, how to monitor setups, how to document setups, and so on. The whole thing that often is pretty painful and not such a fun experience. I always hope after this book you have slightly a little bit more fun with this topic. We are in Claude. We have a project here in Claude. We have added my book in the mini version. Mini version means it's reduced a little bit, like the image quality and so on, so that it fits in here. We will use the mini version that you also get when you buy the book. So we use it here as context. And then we would just prompt Claude to generate the tracking plan. The nice thing about this prompting is it gives you a first idea. If you do this by hand, which you can actually do, so you can skip this and just do it by hand, you really have to think about the different kind of use cases and user scenarios. This is for me the first essential step. When I work with a client, I usually do a workshop type, which is called event storming, where in the end I interview product team, development team, data team, sales team, marketing team, mostly at the same time, all in the same room. And so we map out all the different kind of customer and user journeys that we can find in the product. I say multiple because there are usually multiple user journeys, at least within an app. Users have different kind of use cases they want to tackle. And so it definitely makes sense to map all this out, because this in the end helps you a lot to distill the most important use cases. And this really helps you to get an idea what kind of things do you actually have to track. Because my approach, in comparison to the approach that I used when I was younger, is I don't really care where people click. So I don't go for this, okay, I open up the application and see where people can do stuff, because this is too granular. This will give me too many events. I approach it from more like a use case perspective, or more like a jobs to be done perspective, where I look into, okay, what are the different kind of things that people want to achieve in the product? And this is what I want to track, because this maps pretty nicely to the business or the customer layer. And then in the customer layer, I really look into, okay, how customers are actually progressing through our app, hopefully becoming at some point an active user. But they might also digress. Then they become a churned user, and maybe at some point they even don't use the tool at all. This is my approach how I do everything. And so let's start to sketch this out. Okay, I will use let's say a slightly prepared prompt template, and so it's not something super fancy. I'm asking, okay, we want to do this for Slack. Slack is a team messaging service. So the good thing is, like, when we're talking about these tools, so like I guess Claude already has some context. What we have to do now is like, so what I do now is like I describe the different kind of use cases. What we have now like is a very basic description, but this is actually the right kind where I would always start to model the first event data. Just quickly recap. So admins can create workspaces, can invite users, users can join. Admins can create channels, invite users, users can join, so on. I'm also adding here already like that we are talking about two different types of users. We have admins who create all the things, and then we have users who are actually just users within the space. Then users can post messages, so messages can have attachments. You can mention other users. You can use threads. You can get notifications. You can check the notifications. Messages can be read or not read. Then admins can create a subscription for users. Then again, like different user roles, like guest members or admins. And then like last part, I could have even left it out because it might already be too broad. Admins can add tools to the workspace, but I think that's fine. So with this, I describe the core features of the product. And this is where you can start as well. Take up a document and write down all your core use cases, what you have, and just make sure that it doesn't really get much longer than what I have written there, because if you get longer, it's definitely a sign that you potentially are too granular. Let's add some additional context, which is mostly for the model to generate the right things. In the end, I'm just reminding the model now about specific concepts which I have in my book. So I have a double 3-layer framework, which means first I separate everything into product, customer, and interaction events. And then within these events, you have an entity, an activity, and a property. So it also does it out of the box if you put the book into context here. But yeah, I just want to make sure. Okay, so let's generate the first version so that we have things to discuss. It definitely looks a lot longer than we had yesterday with Notion. So to be fair, yesterday when I was doing the Notion example, I even reduced the different kind of use cases more than I did today. If I would have added more use cases, I think we might have added with something else. But again, like this is the whole point of the series. We want to have a little bit of variation in it. If it will always be the same, it would be boring. First of all, we look into the product level or on the product events. The nice thing here is it already writes down which kind of entities has created. When I start to define the product events, I break up the whole product into core entities. Core entity means these are the building blocks of your product. This is basically an object. Sometimes, like I give the example, like when you talk to your developers, it usually represents a table. If it doesn't have a table, it might not be as important as possible. But honestly, it's not always working like this. Sometimes you have a lot of tables, and so it still might be that this entity is not really an entity. So let's say a more fuzzy rule of thumb would be like, this entity needs to be essentially important. So if you would remove this kind of entity, you would change your product significantly. I think you can use this kind of rule. One of the things that I hope once you follow up with the whole series is like you get a good feeling how to pick the right kind of entities. So let's have a quick look what kind of entities we have here. We have workspace. Yeah, that totally makes sense. We have channels, we have message, we have user, we have subscription, we have tool, and we have notification. These are all good entities. What could be candidates? If we would say, okay, we want to really strip down things, we really want to reduce things, what could be candidates to do that? Notification is definitely something. So, I mean, obviously, notifications play an important part, especially like for getting people back into the tool. But on the other hand, they are not as core as it is. Like Slack would work without notification. There might be even people who say like it would work even better. This could be a candidate where we could remove it. We could bake in the subscription also like with the users potentially. So, but usually like subscription, since it's a revenue one, I always add it as an entity. So it's never really like a candidate where I would say, okay, I won't use it like this. Tools again. I mean, tools is an add-on. And the big question would be like, how important actually is this add-on? This might be to investigate beforehand. How important is it from a strategic standpoint? And this, again, can be a criteria for an entity. If you really have, so let's say, Slack would really go into, okay, optimizing notifications, and you really have something where you know, okay, for the next 6-12 months, we really work on this kind of area, it can make sense to make it its own entity, because like you want to give it visibility. Because in the end, these kind of events then end up in all the different kind of analytics systems that you use. And so it makes it really easy then for people to find it. For me, like all this definition has different kind of levels. One is like, how much do we have to implement? But the other one, which is often overlooked, is the data user experience. When I'm in an analytics tool, or I'm in a BI tool, or wherever, or when I'm an analyst that has to go through and analyzes, I don't want to go through 200 or 150 events to figure out which is the right one. This takes a lot of time. It's very error prone, so I can pick the wrong ones. And yeah, it's no fun at all. Reducing everything here definitely makes sense. But here again, like if we have an area which is really important for us, to have it explicitly, then again makes things a lot easier because everyone will find it immediately. This is the balance thing that I was talking about. Let's say this all makes sense. Notification would be a candidate to maybe drop if you don't want to implement so much. Okay, let's look into the workspace entity. So today we start with the properties. Last time with Notion we started with the activities, but this is fine. I didn't even tell which kind of order I want to have it. Okay, first of all, IDs. So IDs are the most important thing. If you just want to send one property, always send the kind of ID that represents something in the backend, because this always gives you the possibility to enrich your data later on with backend data. At least in most of the analytics platforms, that is possible. And if you pull the data in the data warehouse, obviously, then it's always possible. Always have an ID present. If you don't really want to spend any time in any kind of properties, even when I love properties a lot, I always recommend to use them significantly. But let's say your developers say, hey, you can just have one property, go for the IDs. IDs are most important thing. Okay, so we have the ID, we have the name, we have created ad. This is fine. This is definitely something that could be interesting. Created ad by itself is not really adding so much value because like you cannot really cluster by it. So in the end, like you have to create you have to create an abstraction of it. So an abstraction of it would be like workspace age, and then you cluster the workspace age into older than 5 years, from 3 to 5 years, and so on. So then usually you can use it much easier in an analytics tool. If you really have a property where you have a lot of individual values, by default, they are not really useful, but they can be used to build other properties if the analytics tool is allowing this. Not all analytics tools do this. Of course, if you do everything in the data warehouse, then you can do whatever you want, then created ad is totally fine. Status, I think, is really important. We really want to know, okay, how many workspaces we have in different kind of shapes. Here again, we have the calculated properties. So we were talking about this already in the last video. I'm a big fan of these, but always like, again, here, for example, clustering could make sense. Again, like when we have total numbers of members can work, but to put it into different kind of buckets, let's say bigger than 500, or let's say bigger than 1,000, 500 to 1,000, and so on, then it makes it a little bit easier to cluster things in the analysis. This could be something that you can do. And again, the calculated properties are great, but developers are not really big fan of it, because like if they have to calculate it on the fly, it basically slows things down. So never calculate these things on the fly. Usually the best approach is like to do a pre-aggregation in the backend and then just expose it via the API, so to send it out to tracking, or with, let's say, warehouse data and so on. Workspace domain, I like this. If it's really using custom domain, I think that's really interesting, because like you could do some account-based analysis on top of that. That's good. Okay, let's see. We have workspace created. Yeah, again, in an entity, I'm always aiming for to have a life cycle of this entity. And so again, we have the typical life cycle of created, updated, and deleted. So again, here with workspace updated, we have the big question, does it even make sense to have workspace updated? We had this discussion already yesterday with Notion. So again, we need some idea if a workspace is active. And right now we don't have something here, but we potentially don't even need that. So because what we could do is like we could always send in the workspace ID with all the other events that we are sending. And then with this, we can still derive, like if there are still messages in this workspace, that this workspace is active. So here in this case, I would get rid of workspace updated because like right now I cannot think of so important updates that I need to track an event or an activity for it. Therefore, I think we get rid of workspace updated. Let's have a look at channel. Again, properties. Okay, we have an ID. We have, again, channel name. Maybe it's the same with workspace name. I guess they don't really make sense from an analytical point of view. They can make sense when you use your analytics tool to support some operations. So sometimes you can really set up, it's an interesting area I would definitely look into. It's like you can set up analytics tool that they support operations like customer support, like customer success, like sales and so on. So in that case, at least the workspace name could make sense because like then you could build a report where people can immediately see, okay, for this kind of account, these different kind of workspaces, how active are they? For channel, there's the big question if this is actually really useful. I guess I would get rid of channel name in that case because it doesn't really make sense. Everything else, this I guess is important. Like, so we have public private as channel type. Again, we have some calculated metrics. And here, this is really good. It already did this. We pass on already the channel, the workspace ID, also like here to the channels. So maybe it did it for all the things. Then it would be really great because like, again, the workspace is really like this holding entity and it totally makes sense because in the end, like this is how sales and maybe customer success there usually will work potentially on a workspace basis. To always have the workspace ID there makes it later a lot easier to create specific kind of reports for them. Okay, then let's have a look. Channel created. Okay, makes sense. Then channel joined. The interesting thing is what you can see here is we're now mixing events that are only possible for a specific user role, which is fine, but you should always put it in the description. Channel created obviously is not only something that an admin can do, unless you open up the possibilities for every user. So, okay, it could be both. And here, channel join obviously can be done by every user. Channel archived, I think might be also like an admin, potentially. Well, that's good. I think here we have a good activity set. So channel can be created, joined, left, archived. I think this also like this formulates a good life cycle of a channel. That looks good. Let's look into messages. I mean, if I would be Slack and I would track things, message would be potentially something I would think about because this will create so much event volume that you really have to think about if this is worth tracking. I don't know. The interesting thing is like, what would you build as a proxy? Because the tricky thing is like, messages are the heartbeat of the whole application. They are really important. I mean, it's the same question like when you have a video platform, if you send a heartbeat event every 10 seconds when someone is watching a video. This is basically what we have here with messages. Obviously, I would go for messages, but if you have a similar setup, be prepared that you have to have an event collection system that is cost efficient. Maybe it runs on MTU, monthly tracked users, and it doesn't have a quota on how many events a user can have. So you definitely have to balance this a little bit so that in the end, like it will not break your bank. Okay, but let's have a quick look into different kind of things. So we have a message ID, we have a channel ID. Potentially, we could also now bring in the workspace ID. I mean, data warehouse wide, now we have a channel ID. From the channel ID, we can get to the workspace ID. So we still have a connection, but potentially, at least like when we work in an analytics tool, we might add the workspace ID here as well, just for convenience, so that we don't have to cross-join different things, which in an analytics tool is usually. I like that we put in the sender ID, so because like this allows us like also like on a user base to then later figure out, okay, how many messages are sent by user and so on. That's a good idea. We have different kind of types, also good, like regular, thread reply, system, great. We could also like add bot. I mean, let's say as an extension to system. Has attachment, has mention. This is great because like we don't really care about attachments. We also like don't really care about the mentions. We are just caring about if it's present or not because like it helps us later to analyze. I don't know how many messages, let's say, in these different buckets are sent. And also like if workspaces which are pretty active, if they use more attachments or more mentions, so it can give us something about the usage pattern that can help us to understand successful usage pattern. Okay, thread parent ID is also like makes sense if it's in the thread, but I think we don't really have a thread. So this is like, I think we don't have a thread entity. So then Yeah, we can put it in. So at least that we can match it with our database. Message edited, I'm not 100% sure. But yeah, maybe not. We can just do message create or message send all the time. When I send it initially, then I do an edit and then I send it again. And then in that case, we would set a boolean on edit. Yeah, this can make sense. Okay, that's actually quite a good idea. Okay, now we have message send, read, replied. Again, really good life cycle. The read one, I think it's interesting. But on the other hand, it can have some weird side effects. Obviously, I can go in there and mark everything as unread, mark everything as read. And then in that case, you will send a lot of these kind of messages. It's interesting to, in the end, analyze how many messages have been read and how many messages are open. For that case, it could be interesting. I would test it. I would not 100% be sure if this is useful later for analysis. And again, this is the important thing. The tricky things with analytics setups is that we do a two-step thing. So on step one, we collect data. We have to make a decision what kind of data we want to collect. This is kind of a different discipline, but we always have to keep in mind how we would work with the data. We should not mix up things that we do later and analyze. This is why we don't track a funnel with singular events, because a funnel is an analysis. It has nothing to do with tracking implementation. We should have everything with the tracking implementation that we can build the funnel later on, but we should not put funnel event one, funnel event 2, and so on in here. And again, when you think about how should I track this, think about analysis scenarios. This definitely can make up the decision. It's a tricky thing. You definitely need some experience to be better at it. So, I mean, I'm doing analysis now for over 10 years. Usually I have a good idea, okay, what might be analysis or what not. Then I can say, okay, maybe we don't do this now, so we can keep it in the backlog. Might be an option for the future, but right now, we will not run any kind of message read analysis, and so therefore we can leave it out. Okay, message replied is something similar, but for me stronger. Obviously, because like someone took an action to react to a message. Message reaction could be, for example, something like another event. Or even better, we could put it as message replied. We could have a type where it could be text or just a reaction. Just that in the end, like we have both. Message edited, for example, would be an activity I would most likely at least not implement in the first place. Maybe later, because it doesn't really tell you a lot about your product. Obviously, yeah, people make mistakes. They have to edit things. So it tells you something about the person who's writing if they have to edit a lot. But it doesn't really tell you something about the product. So this would be something I guess I would leave out for now. I would keep the red to see if the data really makes sense. Okay, user entity. Okay, yeah, we have user ID, we have the email domain. This is something which I like to add as well. So obviously I don't want to add the email unless I'm using the analytics data for purposes that I won't pass on the data to other systems. But then again, like check with your data, or let's say with your governance department, if this is okay to send in the email address, then you would need the full email address. In most other cases, email domain is totally fine. Email domain is cool because you can then do account-based analysis. This might be something where your growth team might be really interested in. Okay, we have different kind of roles. We have status. I mean, obviously, deleted will most likely not happen because an inactive most likely also not. So the big question is like if we really need user status, because like obviously only active users can send something in. Yeah, I don't know. Let's say if we would work in a data warehouse with this kind of data, then obviously the status makes sense because we really want to analyze, okay, this is our full user base and we can divide it into the 3 buckets. But event data is a lot about people doing things, and so it's not really, they don't do anything. Last active, I definitely like this. Better translated. Let's say last active in days, for example, that in the end, like this is a number you can better work with usually. This is interesting how many workspaces a user can join, because like this is the tricky thing with Slack. A workspace can have multiple users and a user can have multiple workspaces. We need both. This is good. Okay, user can be created, users can be invited, user joined, user role changed. Again, not an important activity. I would get rid of it. And then potentially also like, so what is missing here is like that users are removed from an account. I think this is important because like this at least tells us something, at least when we really look on the business side of things. This at least cannot tell us something, okay, revenue changes, for example. Therefore, we should really have something like user removed, which can be just a guest, then doesn't have a revenue impact, but it can also be a member, so then it has revenue impact. Okay, subscription. I don't go into full details here. So this is the classic subscription type. Typical properties here. Then we have created, updated, cancelled, which is a good baseline for subscription. Usually I don't do subscription updated in the first implementation if I want to do it simple. I might have subscription retained in here because this is much more interesting thing because like it gives you basically the revenue heartbeat. I would replace this as a subscription retained, and then subscription cancelled and subscription updated is interesting if you want to extend it at some point, if you have a lot of expansion and contraction. It might make sense here because like this model base is based on how many members I add. Therefore, it can definitely make sense to have it. Maybe we should keep it in there. Let's keep subscription updated in here. We should definitely add renewed and ended, because cancelled and ended are two different events usually, because like most of subscription usually run until the paid subscription period is ended. Okay, tool entity, I'm just going quickly over it. Tool installed, configured, removed. That makes sense. The configured can make sense because like tool installed is pretty easy. Configured already means that someone invests stuff. It definitely makes a nice funnel to see, okay, how many tools have been installed and then configured. What we don't have here now is like how the tools are used. So this would be something to think about. I'm still not really sure if we should really include the tool entity, in the first place, because it looks more like an extension. Could be interesting to do it later, but for a core tracking plan, we should maybe get removed it. Okay, notification created, notification read. Again, it's a weak candidate to get started with. Let's say I will do an update in a second on this whole plan, and I think I will remove notification and tool because I think like for first implementation, it's a little bit too overhead. Again, like a tracking plan has also like different layers and different layers. If a feature really becomes important, you usually then extend it a little bit. But again, like always make sure that the tracking plan is not exploding. Okay, quickly on the customer layer. The customer layer sits on top of the product layer. And so it's basically like how customer and how account journeys look like. And so here again, like we have first workspace experience, which makes sense. It can be either that someone creates a workspace or that they join for the first time. So this is basically the first time that people are exposed to Slack, which is interesting. So definitely a customer activity that we should track. Then initial value achieved. Here, for example, from channel created, message sent, and at least 2 other people joined. That's definitely a good value definition. We need more. This is just for one scenario. We definitely need to cover 3 or 4 more scenarios because you could also just join and you can message something and someone is answering. This could be also like another value experience. Okay, value repeated is usually like the same as initial value achieved, but usually like with a time period where you would either you do like we do here at least 5 times or more. And then here, as we said, like within any 7-day period. This is the important thing about this customer stage. They are usually time bound. So you say like here, initial value achieved, this has to happen in the first 7 days. If it doesn't happen, the people don't get the initial value. And this just helps us to understand how well do we do with onboarding. And value repeated means like we're looking on a shifting time window over time and always look, okay, in the last 7 days, have them been active or not? And if yet, then we can say, okay, value has been repeated. Because at risk of churn, for example, like is then the counter things. They have been active before, somewhere in the past, but in the last 7 days, or let's say in the last 14 days to make it a little bit broader, they didn't show any kind of activity, which could be okay. They might be on holiday and they might come back, but at least we can put them already in the at risk bucket because they might to churn product usage, or they might to churn in this workspace. This is quite interesting in Slack's case. People might still use Slack, but they might already churn for the workspace. Okay, quickly on the interaction layer. Interaction layer is like my catch-all layer, which I implement because sometimes people ask, okay, I need to know how many people click in this specific in this, let's say you write a message, you have all the icons down there where you can pick different things. One of the UX designers asked, okay, on which kind of icons do people actually click most? So therefore, I would never have an event like a message options clicked, something like this, because it would create too much noise. Therefore, we have to find a different way. So for this, I used the interaction events, which in the end is like, here in this case, it would be just element clicked. And then we have the different kind of properties that we give to it, like element ID, then the type, locations. It could be like, okay, location message input, then element type would be like icon, then element text, then for example, could be like the icon type. So I don't know, emoji, for example, and so on. So I can add all the context in here that in the end, when really someone asks for it, okay, I really want to know, you can still surface it out. You just qualify it then for them to make it easier for them to use. But it's in the end, like it's a catch-all thing. It also like can often be implemented in some kind of automatic fashion. So you can talk with the developers to really say, okay, can you please make sure that you implement something that all these different kind of clicks on all the different kind of icons, if, for example, component-based, that it can always be tracked in this kind of way. We always track it in the same kind of way. And so this makes it also easier for developers to abstract it and then implement the abstraction. Okay, so I will give some feedback. So with this, like the model will then define the tracking plan a little bit. But with this, we have a really good structure. What I can recommend you now is I will work on the different versions. If you want to see how it looks like, the final one, in the show notes, you will find the link to the blog post where I write up everything that I just explained now. And also in the blog post, you will also find a link to the Miro board where I have the whole design then. And also already in the description of the video, you can find a link to a GitHub repo where I put in the JSON schema for this kind of tracking events. If you just want to have the nerdy quick versions, you can just hop over there and can just check out which kind of schema in the end I added. But yeah, again, video's intention is really to give you an understanding how I make decisions about tracking designs, which we just did. I will now, let's say, after the video, formalize everything and bring everything into the right order, and then you can just check it out how it looks in the end. But I hope this whole video helps you to really understand how you work and how you design on a tracking plan. If you have any kind of questions, if you have any kind of feedback, if you have things that you really want to be covered as well, we're recording a video now every day for the next 20 days. And so if you drop your comments now, I can immediately adapt it. Feel free to do this. Also, like, make sure to subscribe, make sure to like the video if you liked it, and see you in the next video.